In 1959, a man named Nicholas Halish began his biography of Alfred Nobel with a dramatic story. In 1888, Alfred Nobel's brother died, and a newspaper mistakenly reported that Alfred had died. More than that, the paper ripped Albert to shreds and called him, quote, a merchant of death who has amassed a huge fortune from the sales of more and more devastating weapons. Alfred Nobel was so devastated by this that he willed most of his vast fortune to the creation of the Nobel Prizes to improve his image. Although that is a great story, and it has been repeated ad nauseum, but it didn't actually happen that way. Ready to learn why this fake story has been taken as legitimate for the last 60 years? Let's go! Electricity, 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 electricity. So a small part of the story is true. Alfred's brother did die in Cannes in 1888, and a newspaper did mistakenly think that Alfred had died instead. However, their obituary of Alfred was a far more mild misstatement. Here is their statement in full. Quote, a man who cannot easily pass for a benefactor of humanity died yesterday in Cannes. It is Mr. Nobel, inventor of dynamite. Mr. Nobel is Swedish. It was obviously traumatic for poor Alfred Nobel to tell his friends and family that he wasn't dead yet. However, such a mild negativity in this statement seems unlikely to have traumatized Nobel, especially as Alfred Nobel had been known for decades as the dynamite king, and he'd often had a contentious relationship with the French press. In addition, Alfred had complained just the previous year, quote, who has the time to read biographies, and who can be so naive or fatuous as to take an interest in them? Now, it's possible that another French paper made the same mistake, and that French paper called him a merchant of death, and that disturbed him so much that he created the Nobel Prize 7 years later. However, that seems extremely unlikely because we have his letters to his friends and his family and his employees and even his mistress. And nowhere does he mention this whole merchant of death thing. Mind you, Alfred Nobel suffered from depression and would often express his fears and reservations with his friends and family. For example, he mentioned multiple times his reoccurring fear that he would die alone without friends or family. Although Alfred Nobel suffered from melancholy, it was not related to his work, for he felt that dynamite and other weapons of war would lead to peace. See, Nobel thought that if he could make a truly terrible weapon, it would scare countries away from even having wars. In 1877, 11 years before his brother died, he told his friend Bertha von Suttner, quote, I wish I could produce a substance or machine of such frightful efficacy for wholesale devastation that wars should thereby become altogether impossible. He continued to express that sentiment for the remainder of his life. To Alfred Nobel, weapons and dynamite did not make him a merchant of death, but a merchant of peace, and anyone who didn't see it was short-sighted. In addition, in 1892, 4 years after his brother's death, Alfred was convinced by his friend Bertha to attending a peace conference, and he became enamored of the disarmament movement. Nobel then asked his secretary to look into how Nobel could support peace. When his secretary suggested they start a peace propaganda magazine, he replied, quote, I might as well just throw my money out the window. If Alfred Nobel was just interested in improving his public image, wouldn't a peace magazine be a good way to do that, independent of how effective the magazine was to make real change? So where did the Merchant of Death story come from, and why has it taken hold of our consciousness? As far as I can tell, Nicholas Halish was the first person to claim that Nobel created the Nobel Prize because of the premature obituary, and also the first person to state that that obituary called Alfred a, quote, merchant of death. But where did Halish get that idea and that provocative phrase? Well, he didn't include a single reference, so we have to guess at his motivations and sources. But the biggest clue may be the term merchant of death. I was shocked to find that the term merchant of death was created 43 years after Alfred Nobel's fake obituary. See, in 1932, a man was writing an article about a real piece of work named Basil Zaharoff, who was known for his ruthlessness, selling munitions to anyone who had enough money. In fact, Zaharoff was known to encourage conflict and then sell arms to both sides. Therefore, this article was poetically titled, Zaharoff, Merchant of Death. 2 years later, another author borrowed that term for his book on arms dealers, which he titled Merchants of Death, a study of the international armament industry. The New York Times reviewed his book, and after that, the term merchant of death was often used to describe people who sell weapons. By the late 50s, Halish must have heard the term merchant of death in reference to arms dealers, but had not investigated and found that it was only 25 years old, and therefore could not have been in Alfred's premature obituary. This is, to me, pretty conclusive proof that Halish made up his version of the obituary. But why did Halish think that an obituary inspired Alfred Nobel? Well, he might have felt that it was totally illogical that the inventor of dynamite would also create a peace prize. And Nobel's theory that terrible weapons would end war seemed in the 1950s to be so naive as to be absurd. So when Halish read about Nobel reading his own obituary, it must have seemed like the key to the puzzle. When he couldn't find the original newspaper article in an act of journalistic malpractice, he just made it up. After Halish's book was published, the phrase merchant of death was too delicious to not repeat. In addition, the story of a premature obituary inspiring the world's most important prizes was a simple and satisfying origin story. Soon, many biographers were repeating this version of events. In 1991, a Swedish actor and historian named Ken Fant wrote a biography of Alfred Nobel that is considered the gold standard and said, quote, "The obituary characterized Alfred as a, quote, merchant of death, who had built a fortune discovering new ways to, quote, mutilate and kill. He became so obsessed with his posthumous reputation that he rewrote his last will, bequeathing most of his fortune to a cause upon which no future obituary writer would be able to cast aspirations." Although this origin story is satisfying, it just doesn't seem to be true. So if it isn't true, why did Alfred Nobel create the Nobel Prizes in the first place? Well, all the prizes have to do with a 20-year-long friendship with a remarkable, peace-loving woman that I've mentioned already named Bertha von Suttner. And that story is next time on the Lightning Tamers. This video was brought to you by my lovely patrons. If you want to join their ranks and get videos early, get extra videos, and my unending affection, there's a link down below. Either way, if you could give me a thumbs up, share it on social media, and subscribe, that's always appreciated. Also, I have a ton of videos about different science Nobel Prize winners. I promise you learn stories that you didn't know before, and I promise I go to the original sources. Okay, well, thanks a lot and have a nice day.